Hi there to all of the subscribers to Word from the Bird. This is where I'm going to answer some of your questions in a special video just for subscribers. And this is fun because I get to interact with you more directly, something I never got to do really on my Pathos blog. It was somewhat mediated through the comments section there that was very inconsistent. You had to log into all sorts of different things. So I'm glad I can interact with you people directly. And I'm going to answer your questions about the Gospels. You know, the four canonical Gospels, which I think are the best part of the New Testament because they tell you about Jesus. I love Paul's epistles. I love the Catholic letters. I love the Book of Revelation. That's all good, but the four Gospels, I think, really are the front and center of the canon in the New Testament canon for a reason. Okay, and as I tell my students, Paul rocks, but Jesus reigns. So that's why I love the Gospels, and I think of myself at heart as really a Gospels scholar. Paul is kind of like, UFC smackdown combat fighting. Uh, the Catholic letters are a nice place to go for a spiritual retreat. The Book of Revelation is it's a kind of a cross between a sci-fi convention and sort of reading some real deep poetry uh, from the East, like reading medieval mystics, from like the Greek Orthodox Church or something like that. But I always come back to the Gospels, and I think of myself at the end of the day as really a gospel scholar. So I'm really glad I've got your questions about the Gospels. I'm going to go through them, and there are some doozy questions here. There are some really good questions, and I'm hoping I can answer them to your satisfaction. So I'll kick off, first of all, with a question from Noah. Noah asks, how would you explain the differences in Matthew and Luke's genealogies? Oh boy, that's a good question. Now the genealogies are different. If you read the opening of Matthew 1, and then the genealogies in Luke, which I'm Luke 3 from memory, they are different because Matthew traces Jesus's lineage back to Abraham, whereas Luke traces it through Matthew. And people wonder about, well, why the differences, and the common answer, the popular answer, I guess, and I don't have any sort of alternatives to really give you at the moment, would be to say one represents the lineage of Mary and another one represents the lineage of Joseph, or something along those lines. But what is really interesting um, is some of the sort of the add-ins that you get in the genealogies, particularly in Matthew's genealogy. For example, he talks about Jesus being descended from Judah and his brothers, which is interesting. The way Matthew mentions the four women, okay, who are quite notable because they're either all Gentiles or they're all connected with some sort of sexual impropriety, or something like that. And I had a PhD student called Jason Hood who did his thesis on the genealogies of Matthew's gospel. Now I was expecting this to be horribly boring, but it wasn't. It was actually a really good thesis. You can either maybe find it in a library, or you can read a really good review of the book, a summary of that book at Themelios, so you can find it online. And what Jason did is he basically said, look, the way genealogies function, they're not just a kind of, family tree you would get from ancestry.com. It's more like it's meant to be a condensed summary of of the story of your tribe. Okay. So it's not just, oh, here's everyone who I'm related to. Here are the key people in my family tree, and they tell you sort of, who we are. So when Matthew adds in those four women, he wants to deliberately add in four Gentiles, four outsiders to Jesus's family tree to show that the scope of the Messiah's work and who it's going to affect and be significant for, actually is already being prefigured. So that the Jesus movement, the church, will be for more than Israel, because we see in Jesus's human lineage that there's already some outsiders, some women, some Gentiles there, before things even kick off. So that's something interesting about the genealogies. Kayla has some questions too. Actually, Kayla has two questions. Very keen, Kayla. By the way, I hope I'm saying everyone's names correctly. What are some of the things you wished all Christians knew or understood about the Gospels? Oh, that is a good question. Uh, I, I think the number one thing I wish Christians knew about the Gospels is that, yes, they are historically reliable, okay, but it doesn't mean the Gospels were describing what you would see if you were following Jesus around Galilee or Judea and filming him with your iPhone, okay? Um, it's not necessarily a moment by moment summary of everything that happened to him in his ministry. What the Gospels are is summaries, digests, um, material often grouped, I think, thematically, like a bunch of conflict stories that have been put together. They give us the gist of what he says, like, you know Jesus may have spoken to crowds for like 6 or 7 hours, but if you read the Sermon on the Mount, it goes for like 10 or 15 minutes, depending how quickly you read. So they're very summative. And what the Gospels give us, I think, is both history and hermeneutic. In other words, they're telling us this is who Jesus, was, who Jesus continues to be as well. Um, this is what happened, but this is what it means. So they're not telling us the bare facts about Jesus. They're telling who Jesus is, albeit in the context of a certain faith commitment. So the Gospels are both history and hermeneutic, authenticity, but artistry as well. And they're somewhat creatively giving us not just the words of Jesus, but sometimes the voice of Jesus, and trying to um, show how the things Jesus said and did would be relevant and meaningful to the audiences in their own day. So that's what I would want to suggest. So yeah, the Gospels are historical. I think they're very accurate. I've written on this, but at the same time, it's not Jesus, following him around with a camcorder. They're also interpreting Jesus for us, and that theological texture, that hermeneutical lens that they apply is very meaningful, because it's their early attempt to tell us what Jesus means for people today. Second question from Kayla: what advice would you give someone who is wanting to teach, preach through a gospel? That's a good question. That's a good question. Um, I hope in all your churches you do have a regular diet of coming to the gospels. Obviously there's certain seasons where I think it's very important to do that. Seasons like Christmas and Easter, but you should have a steady diet of gospels in your life. I know the Book of Common Prayer normally gives you at least one gospel reading every day. So if I was going to teach and preach through a gospel, yeah, it depends on the audience. It's one thing to do it if you're a chaplain in a nursing home, or whether you're a youth leader, whether you've got a church that's predominantly Anglos in a rural area, as opposed to a far more diverse church in a kind of multicultural area. There's always going to be differences in your audience. The main thing I think I would do is first of all give them an overview of the gospel, and particular what is distinctive about that gospel. So people might just think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as kind of like Jesus story 1, Jesus story 2, Jesus story 3, Jesus story 4. I would kick off by saying no, that there is some distinctive things going on in this gospel. In the case of Mark, I would say I think Mark's main purpose is to be an apology for a crucified Messiah. In other words, Mark is saying Jesus is the Messiah, not despite the cross, but precisely because of it. And that's why half of his king language, all occurs in chapter 15. He really wants to say, the kingdom of God is it comes in the crucifixion of Jesus, because the kingship of Jesus is emphasized in that chapter more than anywhere else. There's a few mentions of kingdom in the Gospel of Mark, but like half of the mentions of king and kingship and kingliness all happen in chapter 15. In the case of the Gospel of Matthew, I think Matthew is trying to hold together the old and the new, and that comes out the way he tells the parable of the wineskins. So the old and new are preserved together. I think that's what Matthew is trying to do. He wants to hold on to the Jewish heritage of the church. He believes that's important because Jesus is Jewish, but he also recognizes that it looks like the future of the church is probably going to be with the Gentiles, um, because they haven't. I mean, in his day, the church has not got a really good reception from the Jewish world, whether from the Jews of Judea or whether from the Jews of the diaspora. And I think not Luke, sorry, Matthew is preparing for the fact that yes, we are a Jewish movement, but I think the future of where this is going to head is going to be largely among non-Jews. And that's why, by the way, I think Matthew was the most popular book of the early church. It wasn't Romans, it wasn't Hebrews, it wasn't Revelation. The most popular book of the early church, the one we have the most copies of, and that was most cited and quoted, was the Gospel of Matthew. Another question from Christy. I would love a discussion on how Jesus would define the word gospel. There is often discussion about evangelion being a message of a ruling king. Much of the Western gospel seems to embrace grace and the forgiveness of sins. I would love to learn more about this. Thank you, Christy. That is a good question. For this, you'd almost have to do a word study in Aramaic. Now, for the life of me, I cannot remember what the Aramaic word for gospel. I know in Hebrew, it's something like Bisora. So any Hebrew peeps want to correct me? Semitic languages are not my strong point. And it means something like the declaration of good news. Now, as you rightly point out, Christy, in the New Testament, the Greek word we find used is evangelion or euangelion, which means gospel. That's used in all of the uh, synoptic gospels, although Luke tends to prefer the verb evangelizomai, which means I preach the gospel. He normally prefers the verb. The word gospel doesn't really occur in the Gospel of John, interestingly enough. Um, John prefers to talk about Jesus teaching the word and the truth and his witness and his testimony. John prefers that language. John is just that uncle in the family who just does his own thing. Okay, that's John. How if you want to understand what Jesus meant by gospel, my suggestion would be go and read Isaiah 52. I think Isaiah 52 or Isaiah 40 for that matter is precisely how Jesus would define the gospel in light of that promise of God at last becoming king and showing his kingship by delivering his people, where there would be a new exodus, an end of exile. There is a new coming king, and Yahweh is coming and coming as king. And this is the good news of the kingship of God. I think that is how Jesus would define the gospel. I mean, at the top of my head, I think of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 15, where Jesus declares the gospel of God. The message of God's kingship, and God is coming as king in and through Jesus. That the coming of God as king is the coming of the kingship of Jesus. That's the way it pans out in his ministry, at least according to the Gospels. Good question as well from Steve. He says it might be a bit too specific, but we'll see. He says in Luke chapter 4, after Jesus has just preached to his hometown crowd a message with a message of liberation, the Greek word aphesis, um, could you share thoughts on why they responded so badly? I mean, this is because, Jesus preaches in Nazareth, and the people get really, really cranky at him, and they then try to like push him off a cliff, and he just kind of somehow walks through them. Um, yeah, why? And Steve wants to know why would they do that? The first thing I'll say, Steve, I think you've picked a great passage. That I think that passage in Luke 4, verses 16 to about 31, is just a brilliant um, summary of the sort of things Jesus taught. I mean, it's amazing on so many levels. First of all, it's basically a summary of Luke Acts in a nutshell. If you want to see the type of themes you find in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, you pretty much find all of them in a nutshell in what is called the Nazareth manifesto, where Jesus goes into the synagogue of Nazareth, gives the shortest ever sermon. I mean, I think he reads from Isaiah, and then gives the shortest ever sermon, which is, I think it's 8 words in like Greek and English. Today, these words are fulfilled in your hearing. So like 8 words, shortest sermon ever. Probably proof that Jesus was not a Baptist, because I don't think a Baptist would ever preach a sermon that short. But Anglicans do like short sermons. But yeah, he does that, and he says these words from Isaiah 61 are fulfilled in your hearing, and they get kind of indignant with him eventually, and Jesus senses what's going on. He says, "Surely you'll say to me, physician, heal thyself." In other words, how can you claim to offer us something that you yourself need? And then what Jesus does, he quotes a number of stories from the Old Testament. He quotes the story about the healing of Naaman the Syrian. He quotes the story about the widow of Zarephath. And here you had people who were healed or helped by prophets like Elijah and Elisha in a time when Israel was largely in rebellion against God. So you've got the idea, if Israel is going to reject the message, then salvation could be extended to those who are normal covenant outsiders, Gentiles, lepers, uh, women, those who are on the margins of society. They're going to receive uh, the blessings, the salvation that Israel has rejected. They then try to run him off a cliff, and he's just able to go through them. So why does the crowd get indignant at him? Number one, I think it's the problem of familiarity. It's kind of like, who's this guy claiming that Isaiah 61 is about him? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, that type of thing. I mean, it's like I can remember the time that when he was like 5 and he fell over and hurt his knee. Well, I know who his mum is. I know who his dad is. And now he's like, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because I'm like all Isaiah 61. I think it might be some of that. The other thing that is interesting is he reads from Isaiah 61, but Jesus leaves out a very crucial part. He leaves out the mention of divine vengeance against the nations, which for some people may have been like leaving out the best part. Okay, so the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to set people free, and the year of the Lord's favor, but he leaves out the mention of divine vengeance. Um, that's interesting. There could be all sorts of reasons for doing that, and as he further explained himself, the idea that if Israel rejects the message, that others, outsiders within Israel, and outsiders external to Israel, could receive the blessings that were intended for Israel. Um, that may have cheesed some people off as well. Bruce Longnecker has done a charming little book. It's something like 100 pages or something, trying to explain why Jesus was able to walk through the crowd. And he points out that the way this scene is portrayed in film, like, the 50 or 60 Jesus films that have been made, he says, the way this has been portrayed is quite interesting as to what people think happened, or maybe could have happened. But thank you, Steve, for picking what I think is one of the best passages in the gospel, one of my favorite passages in the gospel, the Nazareth manifesto. We also have a question from I believe it's Josh. Just let me just check sure make sure I've got it. Uh, he wants to know one book or commentary for each gospel. Would you ever study Q? I know there's a hermeneutic commentary for it, and I just don't know why you'd study it. Okay, one commentary for each gospel. On the Gospel of Matthew, if you had to buy one commentary, I would probably recommend Craig Keener's commentary. Craig Keener is a friend of mine, an amazing, prolific author, a very lovely, gracious, kind Christian man. His commentary is good because he's a man who really gets into details. He loves details. He leaves no stone unturned, whether it's looking at primary sources or secondary sources. He's a details man. And the good thing about his commentary, he gives each section a kind of like a bold heading. And what I've done in my sermon preparation in the past, those like bold headings he used can basically be the like the main points of your sermon. So I find Craig Keener's got great insights into the Gospel of Matthew, and his little bold headings basically give you the outline for your sermon. On the Gospel of Mark, oh boy, this is hard because Mark is my favorite gospel. It's the action packed gospel. I think it was the first gospel ever to be written. And there are a lot of good commentaries on that. I think Bob Gundry nails the purpose of Mark's gospel to be an apology for a crucified Messiah. Morna Hooker's commentary, I think, is pretty good. There's a few good outsider commentaries as well. A South African scholar called Herman Waitchen has done a commentary called A Reordering of Power, and that's like a socio-political reading of Mark. Um, Not the only thing I would read on Mark, but I found that a very interesting volume. Ched Myers is a peace activist who wrote a commentary on Mark, and his commentary is called Binding the Strong Man. A little bit weird and peculiar, but I found it's full of a lot of insights as well. Particularly reading outside that kind of evangelical world where everything is about kind of give your heart to Jesus or 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 try to be a better Christian, that sort of thing. He's good. But if I had to pick one commentary on Mark, I'd probably go with Craig Evans. I think he's got a great volume in the Word Biblical Commentary series, although he's only done half of it actually. Um, Failing that, um, oh, what else? What else would I go for? Um, yeah, James Edwards in the Pillar series isn't too bad. That's very solid and sensible as well. And anything by David Garland, particularly his theology of Mark, is very good. Actually, I'd probably recommend his theology of Mark over anything else. So yeah, David Garland would be my pick there. On the Gospel of Luke, once more, we are spoiled for choice. I think Diane Chen has got a really good commentary in the New Covenant Commentary series. That's a series I edit with Craig Keener. I think her volume is very good, very concise, very solid, very sane, very sober, and is full of really good, sensible summaries and observations about the text. Ben Whittington and Amy Jill Levine have got a good commentary that's fairly recent too, fairly up to date for the New Cambridge Bible Commentary series. So that'll probably be my two main recommendations. Of course, I think Darrell Bock is pretty good on that. His two volumes and the Baker exegetical commentaries. Joel Green as well. I mean, you couldn't not mention his. If I had to pick one, um, I think for something short, sharp, and value for money, definitely Diane Chen. But if I had to pick just one Luke commentary, yeah, probably Joel Green. Probably Joel Green would be the one I'd go for. Concerning Q, Q is the idea that between Luke and Matthew, they shared not only Mark as a source for their own gospel, but also a hypothetical source called Q from the German word Quell, meaning source, which explains the similarities between Luke and Matthew that do not appear in Mark. So in Luke and Matthew, you've got stuff that overlaps with Mark, but then you've got this non-Markan stuff that overlaps. So how do you explain that? And one explanation is that they had access to a common document or a source called Q. Now, there are other explanations for that overlap in material. For example, what if um, Mark was used by Matthew, and then Luke used Mark and Matthew? That would be another explanation for the material they have in common. I tend to think that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark, and they probably had some access to some other common materials. But I don't know whether this was just like one document or some other written sources of some kind. But I do think at a latent stage, Luke has made some use of Matthew as well, because there are a few very curious similarities between Luke and Matthew, which cannot be explained by their common knowledge of Mark, and can't be explained by appeal to Q, because the stuff that's considered Q material is mostly teaching material. And there are a few interesting overlaps, like in the Passion narrative, which would not be Q material. And you think, oh, that's funny that Luke and Matthew both agree on this, because they're meant to be written independently, but maybe they weren't. So I do think Luke has had access to Matthew latently. And there may be something like a Q or a bunch of little Qs that they may have had access to. Otherwise, for a commentary recommendation on the Gospel of John, well, again, I think Craig Keener's commentary on John is very, very hard to go past. He's quite thorough and learned in that regard. Anything by Craig Kester, I think, on the Gospel of John is worth reading. The same for Richard Balcom. And although it's a bit scholarly, I think all the work by the German scholar Jürgen Frey is always worth reading, although that's a little bit more highbrow uh, academic level stuff. At a somewhat lay level, for people who just want a bit of help, F. F. Bruce's John commentary is pretty good, and of course I can hardly fail to mention Leon Morris's very famous John commentary as well. So if I had to pick one, maybe I'd go for Keener, although it would be hard to pass up um, Leon Morris, or the volume by J. Ramsey Michaels that succeeded Leon Morris. So yeah, Joshua, that would be my recommendations for books on the Gospels. That pretty much sums up my answers to all the questions. I hope they're satisfactory. I hope you learn something from all that. I'm just here drinking my cup of tea on a Saturday night here in Melbourne. I think that'll do us. That was fun. I'm hoping to do one of these episodes a month where I can answer your questions and interact with you closely. So thank you very much for listening and joining with me. And hopefully I'll talk to you again in about a month.